Okay, now you can see the presentation of the node. Now, in hardening and tempering the metal pieces after heating it to some set temperature, those heated metal pieces will be cooled down in some cooling bath. But in case of normalizing, the heated metal pieces will be cooled down and the cooling process will be air cooling. Sorry. Now the objective of the normalizing uh, is to remove the internal stresses induced by the heat treatment. That is, this one is the objective of this process of heat treatment, that is to remove the internal stresses induced by the heat treatment. Now as we are discussing here the heat treatment processes, that's why I am giving the stress on heat treatment, but those type of extra internal stresses may be generated in welding, casting, forging, forming or machining. These are obviously some mechanical processes. Through these processes also, if the metal piece go through these processes, then also the internal stress, extra internal stress may be produced in the piece of metal. Those internal extra internal stresses will be removed by this normalizing process. And what is the bad effect or adverse effect of this stress is that if the stress is high, then it leads to some failure of the metal. When the metal is treated with some mechanical process, then that metal will be failed or will may process cracks or something if the internal stress level is high than desired stress level, then obviously metal failure may be occurred. Therefore obviously before hardening steel, this part of sentence is very much important, that is before hardening steel you should normalize it to control the desired stress level. Now why this part of sentence is important, that is before hardening steel, that is in case of tempering. If you can remember the tempering, the process of tempering is done after the hardening, that is mandatory for tempering, but normalizing is done before the hardening of steel, because hardening of steel will generate some extra stress in the metal piece, which is actually used for heat treatment. If we cannot release the extra stresses or we cannot reduce the stress level in the metal piece, then obviously when hardening is done on that metal piece, then obviously failure will occur. That's why by normalizing the metal piece we have to reduce the internal stress level of that metal, so that when hardening is done on that metal piece, the stress which may be produced in the process of hardening, that will not the above of the desired stress level. That is the objective of normalizing. Now low carbon steel and cast irons are the two types of ferrous metals. In case of low carbon steel, normalizing is not required, but if you if you normalize the low carbon steel, then there will no adverse effect on the steel. but the normalizing is not required for low carbon steel, and cast iron are usually annealed. Now analyzing and annealing is the next process of heat treatment. Cast iron is also one of the ferrous metal which is not required normalizing, but that required annealing. That's why low carbon steel and cast iron is not required normalizing, but other types of steels are obviously those are required to normalize by this normalizing method. Now, as the stress level in the normalized steels is lower than the unnormalized steels, that's why the normalized steels are harder and stronger than the annealed steel. As we have not discussed the annealing yet, that's why you may not understand this sentence, that is harder and stronger. But obviously not only annealed steel, but any other steel which have just treated by some process, those are weaker than the normalized steels normalized by this normalizing process. Now this is also tougher than any other steel which have gone through any other heat treatment process or treatment process. uh, Now normalizing process is required when the metal piece is intended to subject to impact load. Any metal piece, ferrous metal piece which is intended to subject to impact, those uh, steels or those metal pieces are require maximum toughness, which resistance to the external stress. Those types of metal pieces are actually need this normalizing process to be done on that. And one point, that is the mass of metal has an influence on the cooling. This may be the next point of normalizing process. The mass of metal has an influence on the cooling rate and on the resulting structure. The piece cool faster and are harder after normalizing the thick ones. Obviously, if the metal piece is thinner, then the cooling time that required is less, and if the piece is thicker, then cooling time required is more. Now coming to the annealing. Annealing is the opposite of hardening. This sentence is important because why? The by annealing, metals are annealed to relieve internal stresses to soften them. This process is also done to relieve internal stress, but by softening the piece of metal. By softening the piece of metal means hardening is actually to make the metal harder, but annealing is the process by which the metal will make softer than uh, that of hardening, and the objective is to make them more ductile and refine the grain structure. Ductileness is an important factor or useful factor for any metal. Obviously, to make the metals ductile, we have to soften them by releasing the internal stress level. And and the process is nothing but heating the metal. That is the general process of heat treatment, heating the metal to a specific temperature. I think I should write it in another paragraph. Heating the metal to a specific temperature, holding it at that temperature for a set length time. Set length time means the time is set, that is 1 hour or 30 minutes or 2 hours, that is set previously, and we have to hold the temperature for that time which is already set, and then cooling the metal to room temperature. And the cooling method depends on the metal and properties desired. Metal and properties desired: some metals are furnace cooled, that is not air cooled, and some others are cooled by burying them in the ashes, limes or other insulating metals. That means this cooling process is very slow than the air cooling, uh, and obviously the cooling process is different from the normalizing method. Normal annealing cooling process of this annealing method is different from the normalizing method, but the objective is much similar, that is to reduce the internal stress level, but the intention is to make them softer or make them more ductile. That is the intention of this process. Now this sorry this table is actually, I think I should write the approximate soaking periods of hardening, annealing and normalizing steel. That is these three process of heat treatment. This is the soaking period or soaking time for the steel, and that is dependent on the thickness of the metal in inches. Uh, and this is the time of heating the piece, and this is the soaking time in hours, that means the holding time of that temperature in hours. Okay, this timing is important when some thickness of steel is given, and there are different types of annealing process which we may discuss in the future classes, but today I'll give you one assignment. One thing I should tell you,